I am Andrew. I am the outreach coordinator for the Critical Zone Network, Collaborative Networks Big Data Cluster, and I am joined here with a cluster member. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Gabrielle Boisrame. I'm an assistant research professor in hydrology at DRI, the Desert Research Institute in Nevada.
What brought you to the Big Data Cluster?
So I was invited by a professor that I knew at University of Nevada, Reno, who was working with Julia and the other people who were starting to put the proposal together a few years ago now. And he knew that I worked on wildfire and how changes to the landscape from wildfire affect the water balance. And he thought that would fit in well with one of the things the Big Data Cluster wanted to do was look at resilience in forests in response to disturbance like fires and drought. And he thought that some of the areas that I had been studying would be good case studies. So even though I'm in the Big Data Cluster, my role is sort of providing some more localized information with fieldwork and modeling in a few specific watersheds to sort of look at very closely to see if we can get information that we can then generalize using big data, or to sort of check what some of the mechanisms are that might be creating some of the patterns that we see with some of this larger scale remote sensing and other types of data that others in the Big Data Cluster are using.
And one of the things, so many fascinating publications. Please, people who are maybe watching this, go and Google Gabrielle's name. Your collaborators are doing amazing work, all sorts of things about the critical zone, which as I'm getting to understand and learn more about the critical zone, goes from below the Earth's surface, what you see when you're walking outside, way down into the bedrock, down into there, all the way up through there, through the soil, through all the little water that's moving around in there. Then you get the surface and the trees, goes all the way up to the top of the canopy, and then into the air just a little bit. Is that
basically the part of the Earth where things live?
Like us and our friends.
Like us, yeah.
And so one of the things as you study the disturbances, which is such a scientific name to talk about these things that happen that are devastating for people, for communities, wildfires and floods they end lives. People have to flee from their communities and sometimes never go back. So in order to get better understanding and be able to predict where resources could go or how first responders might be able to protect businesses and families, you don't want to do a bunch of burning. That's where the model comes into play. Is that a reasonable thing to understand about why you want to understand how modeling works?
Yeah, so I mean, we definitely need modeling because, yeah, you can't just do regular controlled experiments where you say like, okay, we're gonna burn this whole giant area and we're gonna not burn that area. They do that some with prescribed fires on smaller plots, but when we're trying to understand the whole landscape, basically what we have is observations of what has actually happened, and we try and learn from that. And as you said, wildfires, have been very devastating, especially in the last few years. I have some close friends who have lost their homes in some of the California wildfires. But a lot of what I do is actually looking at how you can use what some people can call good fire to actually create a landscape that doesn't respond in these devastating ways to fire. And so basically up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, it's an area that was adapted to burn pretty frequently. And actually the native peoples who lived there for thousands of years would often light fires in strategic locations because it might promote growth of vegetation that was useful to them or open up areas so it'd be easier for hunting and things like that. So fire has been on this landscape always. It's not a new thing. What is new is a combination of climate change, which is giving us longer, hotter droughts that dry out the vegetation, make it burn easier. And then also greater fuel loads. And when people talk about fire science, talk about fuel loads, we basically mean dead branches on the ground, but also live vegetation that if you get a fire that's hot enough, will burn as well. Logs on the ground, anything that will burn is fuel load, which out in mountain wilderness areas is basically dead or live vegetation. And so because people got really good at putting out wildfires about 100 years ago, which seemed like a great idea at the time, and also there were some impacts from logging and from removing native peoples who weren't then managing the landscape like they were before. Over the last 100 years, we've had this buildup of lots and lots of fuel. Normally there'd be, fires that happened more often like once a decade or so in an area that would clear out some of the dense brush, some of the dead fuel on the ground, so that then the next fire wouldn't burn that hot because a lot of the fuel had been removed from the previous fire. But when you get many, many decades of no fires, you get this huge buildup. And then when a fire does get lit and not put out right away, then it becomes really big, really fast, and really devastating and dangerous, which has implications for people, also has implications for the landscape, because a lot of the trees in this area, they're adapted to be able to handle, a fire happening once in a while at not too high severity. But then these really big, hot, fast moving fires can just kill all the trees in a huge area, and they can't grow back the way their seeds are adapted to.
So I've got you, we're just lead author on a paper we'll talk about just in a moment, but as you were just speaking, the thing that I want to, it's more of a personal question. You think a lot about one of humankind's most oldest relationships between humans and fire. Is fire our friend or is fire our enemy?
Well, it can be both, basically. But fire is here. Fire is not something that, like, if we just had enough firefighters and enough water tankers and everything, would go away. It's not going away. We need to be able to live with fire. And fire has a natural process in the landscape. But when it runs into a landscape that is changed really drastically, often due to human intervention in some way or another, then the fire doesn't perform its natural role. The picture that I have up in my background is an area that burned in the Illilouette Creek Basin in Yosemite, where I've done a lot of work. And you can see there's this really dense green vegetation. A lot of those are actually flowers in person. It's really beautiful. And pictures of wildflowers never come out well, I feel like, but there's all these lupins and other plants that are growing, which is possible because you can see all the black stumps. It used to be a dense forest, and all these wildflowers wouldn't have been able to grow in the shade of all those trees, but because that part of the forest has burned, there are fewer trees, that it's opened up to the light, there's sun coming down, all of these flowers and grasses can grow. Also, there's more water available for them to grow because there aren't all these thirsty trees sucking the water out of the ground and stopping water falling as rain and snow from reaching the ground in the first place. And so it's a really beautiful area where you have this mosaic of landscape where there are areas where there's still forest that has remained after the fire. There's places where the forest has been thinned out by fire in patches, which allows these other types of vegetation to grow. And also leaves more water available for the remaining trees and to flow downstream. So fire creates these really dynamic landscapes that are better able to handle drought because there's not as many trees competing for the scarce resources. They're more biodiverse because you don't have just a sort of monoculture of trees. You have this variation of areas of meadow, areas of shrubs. And basically, when you have more diversity like that, a landscape is usually more able to handle a shock to the system, like a drought or another fire. And so fire is definitely the friend of this watershed that's in my background. But of course, fire can also be incredibly dangerous, can cause problems to water quality, can destroy homes, cause all sorts of issues. So it's basically a very dangerous ally that we need to learn to work with better than we have been.
And that's where your work comes into play. Let's look at a very specific part of that work. This recent paper, Trends in Western USA Fire Fuels Using Historical Data and Modeling. First, the lead author, you, congratulations, along with collaborators Timothy and Dominique. You may call him Tim, for all I know, I don't know. And so this is fascinating. I'll put the link out so people can read the paper. But one of the things that really jumped out to me in here is these fuel maps. And I hadn't heard that term before I started looking at and reading some of your work. And I believe that this is a fuel map. Is that correct?
That one, this one is basically just showing the greenish shading areas, just sort of where forests are in general. And then the different boxes and circles are places where there have been, let's see, the squares are where there's been long-term photographic records where we can see what the vegetation is doing and the fuels. And then the circles are places where there are long-term forestry plots. And so if there's an arrow going up, it means that fuel has been increasing over the time period that it shows. If there's an arrow going down, it means fuel loads have decreased over that time period. And if there's neither, then fuels have stayed pretty stable. And so you can see it's mostly arrows going up. And that's those increasing fuel loads that I was talking about.
And as I was looking a bit more at this today, there was another website that was showing you could scroll a picture that was taken in the 40s and a picture that was taken in the 21st century and see how the development of a neighborhood and humans building, they want sort of grass and lawns and little forests and groves and playgrounds around their houses that weren't there historically and provides more fuel for wildfires.
Yeah, it's definitely something people need to consider when they're building in what we call the WUI, the wildland urban interface, are the things that they're planting, making their home potentially more beautiful, but also more dangerous for the wildfires that will eventually come through the area.
So as you're looking at this, how does this help inform either the research that you do in the future or policy making, or is this just like really, really background stuff of like, we have much more to learn?
Yeah, there's definitely more to learn. So part of our goal of this paper was, so basically everyone always says how there are more fuels in our Western US forests due to fire suppression, but it's hard to actually say how much more. Just something, people say a lot, but we wanted to pull together all these different lines of evidence to actually show that there are more fuels. And so that previous map was showing places where we actually have observations on the ground at study plots. And those were all the places we could find that had long-term records. So part of what we suggest in this paper in terms of influencing policy is we need more places where we have long-term observations. A lot of science that gets funded, getting 5 years of funding for a science project is wonderful and hard to do, and something that we were able to do through NSF for this CZ cluster. But 5 years is nothing in terms of the evolution of a landscape or recovery after a fire. And so there are select places like those that were on the previous map where we do have observations over a really long period. And those are extremely valuable, but you can see there's a lot of that forested area that's missing, that is not covered by any long-term observations that we were able to find. So we do argue that we need to set up forestry plots and photo points so that we can track what's happening to these landscapes over time, so that we know sort of what they used to look like and what might be the more, and of course it's too late to see in a lot of these places what they looked like back before I started having all these negative human influences. But at least if we can start now, we can track the changes that are being caused by climate change, by changes to fire regimes.
And I'm certainly, I mean, I know you're not in a position to answer political or cultural things, but like the state of Idaho up here, there's practically no plots up there.
Yeah, I tried to find more data in that area, and I think there might be some, I saw some references to some experimental forests there, but I couldn't find anything published that discussed fuel loads. But yeah, definitely you can see like California has gotten quite a bit of attention. But yeah, places like Idaho seems a lot more sparse. Yeah, so some of it is where the researchers are and where the researchers were 100 years ago.
So as every good science paper says at the end, there's more work. There's more work to do. And so this is also, the big data cluster is looking at ways to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to perhaps take some of this long-term data, run it through some models that may be created, and then perhaps fill in some of this information. But that is a whole other topic. Like, how do you get rid of bias in machine learning and all that sort of stuff, which is what the work of the big data cluster is trying to do. I'll have one more question. So this is a great paper. Thank you for talking a little bit about fuel loads. Again, I'll share this link. There's so much more that we could talk about, but you also did, look at all those pretty colors that you got going on there. Is color an important part of data visualization for you?
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah, you can really influence how people interpret your data by how you use colors, and probably way too much of my time goes into picking the right color palette. And also you have to think about, what if people are colorblind? Are they going to be able to read this?
How to make the data accessible. That's I want to ask one more little thing. I thank you for taking so much time today, but I did want to ask, because you mentioned drought a couple of times. I found this graph about mega droughts and droughts in the Southwest going back to the 1600s. And you may have seen this. This may be a poster that you have in your very office. So of course, this says that we're in the current mega drought, which is over here on screen right. And then it says it hasn't been that dry since 1520. Is this illustration via data of the climate crisis in action?
Yeah, I would definitely say it isn't. Yeah, the extent of the drought being more than any of those other droughts since 1600 is really a huge thing that pops out. And but something, yeah, and then I'm trying to remember, I've seen this or similar ones before. I'm trying to remember exactly how they define drought in this one. But one thing to keep in mind is that in 1572, there were not nearly as many people living in this area, and that those people were not relying on the reservoirs that are now going dry and all the different infrastructure that we have built up that relies on having a certain amount of water coming, a certain amount of snow falling in the mountains and being stored until later in the summer when we need it. So the impact of the current drought is really affected by all the human infrastructure that has been added to this region and the human demands. And also there's, not sure exactly how they're defining drought in that particular illustration, but there's drought in terms of how much it rains, but there's also drought in terms of the disconnect between demand for water and availability of water. And demand can be human demand, but it can also be the atmospheric demand. Basically, when it gets hotter under climate change, then sort of the air sucks up more water from the ground is the most basic way to say it. And trees need to release more water through their leaves in order to survive when it is hotter. And so even if the same amount of water is falling as rain, if it's hotter and drier, and like the air is drier, less humidity, then the same amount of water doesn't go as far in terms of sustaining the trees, the crops, all the vegetation.
That's an interesting correlation between it's raining all the time, but it doesn't matter because it's just going to get hotter, and the same amount of rain doesn't go as far as it did in the past. That's such complex systems you work with every day. How do you keep it all straight in your mind?
Yeah, it's kind of, there's often having to stop and kind of draw out diagrams, be like, okay, so this is affecting that, which is affecting that, and which way are the different drivers going to push the system. Yeah, and discussing with colleagues and making sure I keep up on the latest literature and read new things that people are finding out every day. But yeah, often it can be dangerous to like go too far down one rabbit hole and then have to remember, oh wait, but there's all these other parts of the system that are affecting it too. And so it's good to, talk to colleagues and go to conferences and read papers and always be like remembering what all the different pieces are that people are working on that might affect the one piece that you've been focusing on.
And that's one of the beauties that I find in talking with critical zone researchers, is this more sort of interdisciplinary, cross disciplines thinking about some of these issues, problems, and research. Thank you so much for taking some time. We'll do it again in a couple of months. We'll catch up again, or maybe you've got a new paper you could be working on one right now that could be being reviewed. I'll stay tuned. No spoilers. No spoilers.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording.